My name is James Nixey. I'm the director of the Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House. And let me start by thanking everybody, but in particular, the Friends of European Russia Forum, for the opportunity to present this Chatham House report on myths and misconceptions in the debate on Russia. Andrius Kubilius was due to be with us and to be introducing, not myself. I hope he will be with us to save my bacon in about 5 minutes' time, and I'll make my introductory remarks first, and then he'll join us, and then some of my co-writers will speak, followed by some respondents in the classical style, if you will. Now, hopefully you are, ladies and gentlemen, familiar with this report. It's made some waves. It is actually the most successful Chatham House publication ever. I will stop blowing my own trumpet now. The rationale, perhaps I should say something about that. It was for producing a volume about the mistakes that Western countries continually make about Russia, the things we get wrong. And I'm sure everybody listening is weary, if you like, of the constant mistakes made by our own policymakers over the years. And indeed, because we're human and because we're experienced, we are, it must be said, irritated by the factual errors, the poor judgment, and the moral failures, perhaps, made by our peers, by our fellow experts in the analytical world. So we wanted to have something to show, to explain why this is happening and why, and what could be done better. So I'm sure you all have your bête noirs. I would love to hear them in the discussion, perhaps. And of course, therefore, this publication isn't exhaustive, but I would like to think that it's perhaps more than the sum of its 16 parts, because they combine to show how poorly Russia is understood. Now, I'm always a little bit nervous when I hear that phrase, by the way, that Russia is misunderstood, because it is used, of course, by the most fawning of appeasers and apologists, and indeed by Russian nationalists themselves. But I know that you all know that many a decision maker thinks that the Kremlin often has half a point, or maybe more than half a point, when in fact it I'm sorry to say, very rarely does. And that's because, I suppose, a little bit of knowledge, if you like, can be a dangerous thing. You know, most people who know Russia reasonably or very well aren't encumbered by sort of some ideological conviction, such as, say, anti-Americanism. And they do understand that Russia doesn't behave as it does because of, NATO enlargement, as my colleague James Sherr will talk about in a minute. We all know Ukraine and Belarus and Russia are all separate nations, all deserving of allied support and the protection of their territorial integrity as much as anybody else. And we probably all know that cozying up to Russia to form an alliance against China, as I will talk about later, simply won't work for multiple reasons. But superficially, I have to concede, these myths and misconceptions are quite attractive. I know this because I try to have friends who are not in our business in the Russia world, and this is what they come out with. It's what they think and they know with this little bit of knowledge as educated, reasonable, and really quite diplomatic people. So all of this these myths are manna from heaven for Moscow, if you like, which either inserts these myths into the ecosystem or cultivates them if they are already there. So I guess my point is that much of Moscow's dirty work, if you will, is done or at least assisted or helped on its way by us, specifically by well-meaning diplomats who are hardwired to find ways to cooperate with tricky interlocutors, but not realizing that the Russian side is not just awkward, but actually they mean us harm and to upend us, often while lying. So although sometimes I have to say they are admirably straight talking compared with us, and our diplomats' instincts are reinforced by the supposed economic logic of the business community, and of course friendly fire by some of our fellow Western analysts. So this paper, this report, is, if you like, a modest effort to set the record straight and, of course, suggest alternatives, as is incumbent upon us in the think tank world these days. And although, of course, it won't change Russia, but I hope perhaps that at best it might help to deter some of its worst instincts and at a minimum, I suppose, restore a little self-respect, which I feel we are lacking. And I suppose at least obey the incontrovertible logic or evidence when faced with it. That shouldn't be too much to ask, should it? So that's really all I wanted to say in terms of an introduction to the report. I don't know if Andrius Kubilius is back with us now. All I can see on my screen is Konstantin Eggert, which is absolutely a pleasure, but he was due to come in later. Andrius Kubilius, are you with us? If not,
yes.
You
yes.
are. Sir, yeah. I'm sorry that I jumped the gun there and I overtook you. If you would like to sort of do your introductory remarks, and we can get on with the meat of it, if you like.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, James. Really appreciate it very much. that in those, quite difficult circumstances for myself, you helped me, to open this traditional seminar of our Forum of Friends of European Russia. And I'm very happy really that we have this forum devoted to Chatham House report, which we shall speak about. You James, presented a little bit, the title and what it's about. So for me, these difficult circumstances were that I was at the same time, just before beginning the seminar, I had a discussion in European Parliament on our report, which will be discussed in the plenary next week, just before elections to Duma. And the report is devoted to, is called Recommendations to EU Institutions on EU Policy Towards Russia. So when I am, reading your report, Chatham House report, I see a lot of things which really are very important for our report, which we elaborated, here in European Parliament, and which is supported by a broad majority, at least in Foreign Affairs Committee in AFET, we got a huge majority from different political parties, and while looking forward, how we shall implement that report and all those recommendations, I see really that your report was elaborating really what kind of misconceptions we have on the Western side when we are talking about Russia. Those 16 topics are really crucial. At the end, I would say that while reading your report and all those different topics, really I was enjoying this very deep analysis, which is very important, academic and experts analysis. But at the end, I was really fascinated by your summary and so-called 10 principles for the West for dealing more rational and effectively with Russia. I would say that it could be, some kind of, 10 commandments to everybody who is discussing, Western policy towards Russia. I would put, into all the major cabinets in EU institutions on the wall, those 10 commandments, because that is really what I would say, 10 principles which would allow us to overcome what we now, at least in our circles here, we liked very much, this terminology from Wolfgang Ischinger from Munich Security Conference on Westlessness. So your 10 commandments exactly are how to overcome Westlessness, in building some kind of more effective and more rational EU policy towards Russia. So that is my remarks on, for introduction. Really, I am very happy that we have a good team of speakers. And first of all, of course, we would go for presentation of Chatham House report findings and recommendations. And we have 4 speakers from Chatham House, from those people who prepared the whole report. And if that is my obligation, so I am very happy to introduce the first speaker, whom we know very well from all different earlier possibilities to meet and to speak. It's Mr. James Sherr, who is senior fellow and Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security, and also associate fellow for Russia and Eurasia program, Chatham House. So and his topic is on Russia and the West, including NATO. So James, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kubilius. Of course, when I first met you, you were Prime Minister at the time, so I still think of you as Prime Minister Kubilius. There are actually 3 myths surrounding the issue of NATO enlargement and its effect on Russia. So I want to say something about each of them and then say something about a mystery that has no conclusive answer. The first myth is that the main source of contention and tension in Europe, Russia's demand and its feeling of entitlement for a sphere of influence on its periphery, was driven by and created, or at least intensified, by the policy of enlarging NATO. But Russia defined these interests as vital interests almost 3 years before anyone in NATO gave any serious thought to enlarging NATO, and even before most of the post-communist governments in Central Europe were considering joining NATO. And at the time, when Deputy Foreign Minister Sherr wrote his report in September 1992, in which he said Russia has to be leader of stability and security on the entire territory of the former USSR, neither he nor his colleagues were anticipating a problem. They were happy to recognize Ukraine's independence because they believed nothing would come of it. They assumed that the West would never sacrifice good relations with Russia for the sake of lesser and unimportant people in Ukraine or even in Central Europe. So those two issues were unconnected. The second myth is that the war in Ukraine of 2014 was driven by NATO enlargement. No, it wasn't. The first step of President Yanukovych in 2010, when he became president, was to take the issue of closer integration with NATO off the table. Ukraine in short order became an official non-bloc state. He renounced any aspiration of Ukraine to join NATO. And then immediately Russia let it be known that the potential casus belli, the issue of importance, which became the casus belli, was even Yanukovych's determination to pursue a course of EU integration. And EU enlargement by then had become a major issue. So again, the issue of NATO had been diffused and neutralized by the time these events occurred. The third and key issue, which is the one my colleague John Loff focused on in the report itself, is that the West issued a promise not to enlarge NATO. No, the West did not issue a promise. All the relevant papers of the negotiations that did take place in 1990 over the modalities of German unification, all of those papers on both the Russian and Western side have been declassified. The whole record of negotiations is there. And these two sets of records are remarkably convergent. And they make it absolutely clear that the issue of a guarantee or promise that NATO would not enlarge was not raised. It did not come up. No guarantee was asked for. None was given. The issue simply didn't exist. The issue at the time, understandably, was the German Democratic Republic, and that alone. At a time when the Warsaw Pact commitment still existed, at a time the group of Soviet forces of Germany was still deployed there, at a time a lengthy transition period was envisaged for withdrawing those forces, at a time when Gorbachev assumed the GDR might survive in some form, and if it didn't, a confederation with the Federal Republic would emerge, and Germany as a whole would be neutralized, At a time, Poland was expressing fears of a unified Germany and looking to the Warsaw Pact to provide some kind of guarantee against a resurgent Germany. In other words, these were very different times, and none of the decision makers then, absolutely none, were envisaging what subsequently occurred. So the subject did not arise, no guarantee offered, none given, and there's no room for interpretation here. It's a matter of fact. Now, here's the mystery. Over the course of 1990, and then subsequently, the Russian Federation signed declarations, commitments, based on the principles that didn't differ from the document to document, the Paris Charter of November 1990, the Treaty on the Unification of Germany in September 1990, 7 years later, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the OSCE founding document of December 1994. Russia signed up to all the Helsinki principles. The independence, unqualified sovereignty of countries, their freedom to chart their own course in security relations, their freedom to identify their own security partners. Why did they do that when we know that even shortly afterwards, they objected to all these principles and repudiated them? Well, I replied to some of this before, but the main thing is that they did not believe that signing these statements would do any harm, because they didn't believe that what actually happened would be possible. That all the former communist states would embark upon a course of full integration, Euro-Atlantic integration with the West, that NATO would eventually enlarge, that the West would develop its own relations with Ukraine and Georgia without going through Moscow. None of this was anticipated. And you can argue about why, at the time, people were so short-sighted. The Russians in particular. Fine, have that argument on another day. The fact is, the Russians, to our eyes, in all sincerity, signed up to a post-Cold War settlement, which in short time they questioned and then repudiated. And my last point is this. By the time expectations and realities finally converged in Europe, Russia's security perceptions and its perceptions about the West had darkened for other reasons. First, there was the Kosovo conflict, which was very traumatic for understandable reasons, because however justified NATO's intervention might not have been, it was not a defensive act. Milosevic had not attacked any NATO ally. And those who believe NATO is a purely defensive alliance were shocked. And this led to a whole sea change in Russian thinking about the threat from the West. Secondly, views about the European Union were changing. And it was understood the EU represented a value system and a scheme of integration at variance from the system of governance taking shape and solidifying in Russia itself. And so when the EU began to enlarge, this too was seen as a disturbing development. And I would say the main thing is that Ukraine defined its independence in the way it did, in a Euro-Atlantic direction, and that the West supported this, and the West refused to be limited or inhibited by the Russian viewpoint with regard to this. And the only way the Russians could explain the West's Ukraine policy was that it was designed to weaken and break up Russia. And these views have solidified and solidified, and we have seen them reappear in Vladimir Putin's recent article about Ukraine. So in conclusion, NATO enlargement was certainly an important factor in darkening Russia's perceptions about the West and about the security environment, but it was not the only factor. It was not necessarily the most important one. It does not change the fact that Russia signed up to a range of principles and commitments that it has now repudiated and refuses to honor and observe. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, James. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Oh, camera. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thanks a lot, James. Really appreciate very much, as always, your views and your opinions. And now, exactly as you ended, we are moving to next speaker, to Mrs. Orysia Lutsevych, who is again very well-known researcher and head of Ukraine Forum in Russia-Eurasia program in Chatham House. And since James exactly finished about Ukraine, as we understand, Mrs. Lutsevych will speak exactly about Eastern Partnership states and some kind of misconceptions here. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to join, and I'm specifically, Prime Minister, pleased to hear that Chatham House research papers are still kind of influencing EU policies in Russia, which with Brexit is quite special. So thank you very much for mentioning the relevance of this report. And of course, myths, they exist for the purpose from the old times. They helped people to interpret and make sense of the world. And they were chosen for a certain reason. So I don't want our listeners to get a feeling that all myths are completely negative. In this particular sense, of course, we are trying to, in a way, write this methodology to have a more informed policy towards Ukraine and the neighborhood. And we hope that this collection of 16 chapters will help readers to decipher, in a way, Russian world, its outlook for itself, because there are some myths that are related to the future of Russia after Putin and to the neighborhood of Russia. And there are three particular myths that are, of course, directly related to Eastern Partnership, Ukraine and Belarus in particular. James Sherr already mentioned one that is number 7 in the book about the privileged spheres of influence, written by our colleague Kate Melson. And there are 2 more. One is written by my colleague Anais Maran about Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus are one people, myth number 11. And the one I co-authored, which is myth number 12, about Crimea was always Russian. So what these myths in a nutshell say, and why are we talking in a way quite a lot about history, especially when we are looking at myth 11 and myth 12. And we see its unfortunate endurance with the article that James also mentioned, authored by President Putin about this large 5,000-word historical essay, where he argues basically that because of shared history, Ukraine, Belarus, and the region is doomed to a shared future with Russia. That this means that these countries should have similar model of governance. There should be no pluralism and, in a way, kind of Russian-style despotism, because this is, the mores of these countries demand that the West should not bother investing its financial and political capital into liberal democratic reforms, because they will never work in this part of the world. And of course, Crimea is a peninsula of Russian military glory, a gift to Soviet Ukraine, and it was a genuine self-determination. And I think also partially of what James already described, that to have an enduring peace in Europe, Russia needs a buffer zone. It needs this cordon sanitaire, and the West has to accept it. I mean, this is what modern Russia, and we see it repeatedly, preaches. And I think it would help us also to understand why these myths are useful today and why are they being repeated so often. And I think partially, of course, is to justify the current quite revanchist policy of Russia towards the region, but also it helps to perpetuate the crony capitalism and autocratic system at home inside Russia, putting it separately as a different civilization, not what you called friends of European Russia, but friends of different Russia they would like to see. And I think also that it's very important for the countries of Eastern Partnership, the way Russia would like to portray them as states that have no agency, that are only entities that could exist with limited sovereignty, where Russia will in a way govern them because these elites are crony capitalists, useless, and they cannot achieve anything. So there is a certain purpose for this. And of course, in the report, we in quite big detail describe why all of this is false. And just to say a few words about this ancient, past dependency that Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus emerged from the Kievan Rus. And anyway, Putin's recent essay, and this is where we saw our Chatham House publication, again, resurfaced in Ukraine in response to that, saying that in a way, modern Russia and ancient Rus are two quite different notions of today. And of course, there was part of elite of Rus that moved towards Novgorod and established some dynasties there. But the fact that Ukrainian state was formed and the kind of nationhood spirit around the Cossack Republic, where constitution of freedom was dreamt about in 1709, that had a very different basis for the statehood at Russian. To bring a little bit of history of one of the famous Ukrainian scholar, Mikhailo Dragomanov, who actually lived and worked both in Russia, in Kiev, and then was expelled by the Tsarist Empire and worked in Switzerland and Sofia. He actually had this idea of understanding the influence of the West on Ukraine. So this is not new. This is not Eastern Partnership taking place today. Even at the beginning of at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, there was always this wind coming from the West through Ukraine all the way into the St. Petersburg and Moscow. And that wind in Ukraine was always a notion of more pluralism, European cosmopolitan coexistence rather than Russian melting pot of the empire. And this is where the difference comes that is relevant for today. That is relevant for today, the way Ukrainian nationhood and statehood is being built. And I would like to just say a few words what that means for a good policy, because each of the chapters has that particular section. So I think it's very important for the good policy of the European Union, for the same matter United States, is to reject this past dependency as something that, Putin tries to drag his country and the region back to history. Whereas what we need is to overcome history. And Ukraine is showing that it hasn't passed the last kilometer, but is on a good track of overcoming its history and showing that change in that region is possible. Also, I think that this entitlement to an exclusive sphere of influence of the sovereign state should be clearly and publicly rejected, because these are quite different agendas that the West and Russia has, and would be useful both for, I think, Russian elite and for regional leadership and societies to hear that. And we do hear reiterations of Ukraine's sovereignty and support to democratic Belarus, so that is the good news. But I think also it's important to assist Ukraine in particular. And it's not just because I run Ukraine Forum in Chatham House, but I do believe that building Ukraine's own agency and creating inclusive economic and political institutions, and this is what the European Union is so good at, and this is exactly what Ukraine needs for modernization. So there's a very natural partnership. And this partnership not just comes with bilateral treaties or elite negotiations. It comes from the demand of the society. And if you look at Ukraine, you have the values of self-expression growing. You have almost 70% of Ukrainians favoring freedom rather than stability and order, about 16%. So there's a real constituency for change that may help breach this last kilometer for modern Ukraine. And finally, I will just say on the non-recognition of Crimea and a quite important Crimean platform that was launched 2 weeks ago in Kiev. And I think this is something that is important, because what Crimea means for the global international order. If Crimea remains the case where impunity prevails, we will not live in a better and safer world. And we should not believe that Crimea is a special case. We do know that there are issues of South China Sea, and there are many other countries who may harbor these very dangerous sentiments based on fixing historical injustice. So Crimea should remain non-recognized, sanctions should continue. And in the long term, I do believe if we overcome these mental blocks in our thinking about Russia, about the region, we will see at a European Russia. I deeply believe in it, because, I've mentioned Drahomanov today, and it's quite refreshing to read some of his reading, where he says that political freedoms in Russia, which would mean representation, oversight over executive, human liberties, freedom of press and association, can contain what he at that time sought: Polish, Hungarian, German influence over the Slavic people. So this is the prescription from Ukrainian intellectuals and historians about both the future of this region and the future of Russia. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Orysia. And now we are moving again back to James Nixey, who does not need too much of introduction. He's director of Russia-Eurasia program in Chatham House. And he will speak, as I understand, about Russia and China. And if that's correct, on misconceptions in that field. So please, James.
Well, thank you very much again, sir. I mean, yeah, I feel a little guilty as I get two bites at the cherry right now. But myths regarding China and Russia do strike me as being amongst the most topical, considering how much China is occupying minds as the greatest medium or long-term challenge we face, perhaps. And the UK Integrated Review of Defence and Foreign Policy, which I'm sure you're well familiar with, very succinctly put it that China is the greatest long-term challenge, whilst Russia is the greatest immediate threat. I think that was nicely put. It strikes me as accurate based upon maybe two simple facts. But one, Russia is declining by most measurements, and China is rising on most measurements. And number two, but if you like, but Russia is simply killing more people beyond its borders, to put it bluntly, crossing more borders in anger, making more overt bellicose threats, clearly doing a lot of damage on the way down, if you will. So that's the opening balance there, if you like. So here it is so often. It's not some straw man that the West's relations with Russia must be normalized, apparently, in order to counter the rise of China. And as I said in my introductory remarks again, and it's a superficially attractive premise, because if China is this oncoming storm, then Western powers should surely make an ally of Russia and help combat, or at least weather it, due to the understandable apprehension over China's capabilities and its agenda. And policymakers like to claim this realist attitude to the world, or that they're pragmatic. You hear it so often. And that's unfortunately normally code for advocating some kind of shabby deal or a compromise, which is exactly what this is, I'm afraid to say. Ignore Russia's sins, downplay, forgive its past crimes, give it leeway on its future ones. The Cold War is over anyway, hadn't you heard? And besides, Russia's true place is surely obviously in Europe. I say that to the European friends of Russia. Friends of European Russia, I'm so sorry. So why is it wrong? The challenge, I think, from Russia to the rules-based international order is, let's be honest, older than that presented by modern China. But age doesn't diminish the fact that the former's substance or importance, if you like. So Western policymakers are arguably, they're guilty of comparative complacency, given the temptation to focus on the emerging threat, the emerging political, economic, security, and international governance issues associated with China. And I can't say this enough. I will repeatedly say in the next couple of minutes that I'm not trying to diminish the problems that China poses us. China's rise may well not prove to be peaceful, especially given Beijing's obvious assertiveness in the COVID-19 era, and obviously in Hong Kong. Orysia's already mentioned the South China Sea, and you can't sort of dismiss its efforts to annex territory there or to claim areas, small and large, held by India and Japan right now. Nor can you excuse the kidnapping and incarceration of politically inconvenient individuals, or Beijing's muzzling of Hong Kong activists, or the propping up of successive North Korean dynastic leaders. It's neither necessary nor right to downplay these issues. It's just that the threat is different from the one posed by Russia. And recognition of the former just doesn't unequivocally justify this softer line on Russia that many advocate to deal with China. I think in considering the challenges posed by China and Russia, the twin challenges they pose, it's a mistake, I think, to believe that the luxury just has the West has the luxury, if you like, of dealing with one and ignoring the other. But I will offer four arguments which, if you like, deconstruct the unite with Russia against China argument. So number one is that it underestimates Russia and the damage that it can do. It overlooks the, quite frankly, egregious nature of Russia's documented contraventions of international rules and norms. China is not, as I alluded to earlier, invading countries right now, or using chemical or biological weapons, or shooting down planes, to say nothing of manipulating, numerous elections near and far. It may do these things, or some or all of them in the future, but it's really not there yet, if you like. The second flaw with seeking to use Russia as a balance against China is that this prematurely dismisses a prospect, however slim you might feel it is, for sustainable interactions between Western countries and China. The West and China will almost certainly continue to clash on many areas, probably severely, but it doesn't automatically mean that cooperation in good faith is fundamentally beyond Beijing. I mean, you need China experts here to tell you this, and I'm absolutely not one, but I'm, for what it's worth, not willing to totally dismiss the possibility that a sustainable and reasonable relationship can't be managed. It may not be possible, but for my money, the jury is still out there. The jury is not still out, I'm sorry to say, on Putin's Russia. It's definitely reached its verdict there, it seems to me. The third mistake is quite simply that some sort of grand bargain is just unlikely to work. A tenable alliance with the current regime led by Putin has proven impossible and will continue to elude Western diplomats and governments for the foreseeable future, no matter how hard they try. Regardless of whether ceding the sphere of influence that we've discussed at length now to Russia is even within the gift of the West, which I rather doubt. I mean, where is the evidence that Russia would be a reliable partner and become a less disruptive international actor, if accommodated, as these people suggest? And where is the evidence that a better relationship with Russia would help address the challenges from China anyway, or deter China from acting in a particular way, for example, asserting itself territorially in the South China Sea, or in relation to Taiwan? Russia, in any event, is inclined, it seems, to align itself with China on specific issues these days, such as human rights, given the two countries' ideological similarities, if you like, as fellow autocracies. And then the fourth and final layer, and then I'll stop there because I've just been speaking too much today, is that is to assume, I suppose, that normalization of ties with Moscow is somehow needed to prevent the development of a Russo-China axis that perhaps indirectly could reinforce China's growing reach and capabilities. But it just seems to me that such an axis is less of a plausible prospect than is sometimes assumed. Russia and China do, I concede, work together in multilateral institutions such as the UN, on issues such as cyber governance, human rights, but it's not axiomatic, it seems to me, that the two countries will draw closer together in some broader strategic relationship. This sort of, this marriage of convenience will not go much further than that. In the light, it seems to me, of China's potential exposure to international opprobrium as the origin point of COVID-19, say, or the Chinese leadership seems to me to be unlikely to decide that its best move is a significantly closer relationship with a pariah state such as Russia. Western fears about losing Russia to China seem to be driven more by Russia's perceived pivot to the east since 2014, but it's questionable to me whether such a pivot ever really occurred. And so although Russia's relations with China have been strengthening since the 1980s, the concept of a pivot is actually rather a recent one, and I think a faulty one. It's a construction often used by Russia itself to unnerve Western audiences and to give the impression that it has strategic options. But the reality is that Russia's elites really remain overwhelmingly Western-centric in their identification of foreign policy risks and opportunities. So I'll leave it there because I don't want to go on too long and I know we've got a lot to get through, but thank you very much for your attention on this particular issue.
Thanks a lot, James. Thanks a lot. And now we're moving towards misconceptions and myths on Russian domestic politics. And it's my pleasure to introduce Nikolay Petrov, Senior Research Fellow from Russia-Eurasia program from Chatham House also. Please, Nikolay.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I do hope next month to come to Vilnius in person. Let me start with saying that my role in the project was to kill certain hopes. And first of all, the hope that it's needed just to wait until Putin will go out and the situation will become much better than it looks now. It's not the case. And I would like to present a couple of reasons why, in my view, it's not the case. First of all, we do have public mood in Russia, and Putin, in case of foreign policy and the regime in general, is supported by, majority of Russians. Partly it's due to propaganda, but let's not share wishful thinking, having in mind that majority of Russians are strongly against the foreign policy. It's the single direction of the Kremlin's policies, which is wholeheartedly supported by many Russians. Second, there are institutions, or there are very weak institutions, so there is a lack of institutions, and when and if Putin will leave from the political stage, we'll see the same lack of institutions, and it's needed not to have an illusion that all of a sudden overnight something positive, strong will appear at the place where institutions are absent. And when speaking about institutions, I do mean elections, and not only we should speak about Russian elections as about a fake, but we should have in mind that there is no experience of participating in competitive elections for many years. And this experience is badly needed to provide for social and political capital, without which any prospects for positive future development are almost absent. There is no self-administration, and this is a very important point, which is not that much at the center of public attention. The fact that municipal self-administration is almost absent for several years in a row after the last municipal reform has been undertaken. So not only there is no experience of managing at any level by means of elections, but there is no experience of self-administration, and will take a lot of time to restore this experience. Of course, it's possible to say that there is memory of political institutions which did exist a while ago, and that's why restoration of these institutions can go on faster than in case this memory would be absent. But we should have in mind that there are no political institutions which could promote development of the country in positive way immediately after disappearance of Putin and his personalistic regime. And finally, it's about elites, which is very important point as well. So I did mention that there is no public policy in Russia, there is no competitive elections in Russia, meaning that we should not wait for new elites to appear immediately after window of opportunities will emerge. And this once again leads to the conclusion that what comes after Putin will be hardly better than what we see now, what is under Putin. And we should wait for many years of very serious efforts to be made both within the country and from outside in order to promote development in a different direction. What does it mean in terms of Russia's relations and European relations with Russia? I think the fallacy, if not the myth, that we should just wait for Putin to go out is very dangerous in the sense that it creates a vision that nothing should be done actively. It's needed just to wait and to wait for restoration of Western to Russia relations in a way that they used to be before Putin's coming or in early years of Putin. Strategic approach is needed, and this is exactly what the West, or at least European Union, is not very good at if it goes about Russia. And this strategic approach should be combined with flexibility, because it's understandable that authoritarian regimes are much more flexible, easier to move, and democracies, especially such a complicated bodies as European Union, cannot move that fast, but they should move. If to look at what's going on in Russia, and here is my last but one point, that the very analysis has been done before we've seen certain preliminary results of transformation, political transformation, which is going on in Russia since January 2020. We do see how intensive is political development, unfortunately, in negative direction in Russia, which means that any strategic approach should be overseen, reviewed all the time in order to react onto very fastly changing environment in Russia. And to summarize results of this 2020 till today development in Russia, I would say that what we see now, I think, is close to how Russia will look after Putin, in a sense that we see Putin in a very different capacity. And not only this is due to the pandemic, but this is due to the fact that here is how newly emerged regime should look. Putin will not leave from the office of the president, I am pretty sure in this, but his role will be different, and it's already different. Putin is not very strongly engaged into daily activities. Well, he is doing one event a day. He's appearing pretty rarely, but the system works. And I think the very idea is to switch to autopilot mode. There are 7 sub-centers of power. Some of them did exist in past, like the government. I mean, the government led by the prime minister. Some of them are established recently, like the commission which should promote international development led by Dmitry Kazak. And it's almost finished at the stage of design on the paper, but it should appear in flesh. And that's why I think that political development in Russia will be much more intensive and much more conflictual in coming month, especially after forthcoming parliamentary elections, Duma elections, than the one we've seen now. At the stage when the regime has been changed at the level of certain institutions which did not start to work and did not start to cooperate or to conflict, to come to a conflict with each other, it looked better. At the stage when large-scale replacements of top elite members should take place, as well as those institutions which are established should start their working. It should be much more complicated. And here the usual formula, containment, engagement, and isolation, does not work well and should be added, and it's not enough. And my last point is that when speaking about Russia, and I was privileged to speak the last after my esteemed colleagues did tell a lot about the project in general and about the general vision, we should differ between the regime, the state, and the country. And we should not forget, and I think it's not needed to tell this here when speaking to friends of European Russia, that there is still huge support, although sometimes it's not that visible, for European future of Russia. And when speaking about Russia, we should not have in mind only Putin and the regime, but we should have in mind huge diversity, especially represented in big cities, and huge support for the way of European development of Russia. And this is my last positive point. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Petrov. Now, yeah, we finished the presentation of Chatham House report. Now we are moving to next stage, the comments which we asked to make several very well-known experts. But before that, some housekeeping orders, you know. After those comments, there will be possibility really to have maybe not very long, but Q&A session and small discussion. So everybody who wants to make comment or ask a question should write it in a written form in a chat, and we shall try to read them. Some people will get, as we know, some requests to make comments, and we are ready to allow them to make simply on camera, but all others should use chat facility. Now, really, we are moving into comments stage, and my pleasure, first of all, to ask Mr. Konstantin Eggert, very well-known political analyst and consultant, journalist, Deutsche Welle, you know, and we know him also as good friend for time being, living in Vilnius, but showing photo of, I don't know, of what, of Stockholm perhaps.
Yes, it is.
Whatever. Maskirovka.
No, Prime Minister Kubilius, thank you very much. Yeah. It is Stockholm, and I just love this panorama because that's my my mother's birthplace. So I can use a few panoramas for my ancestors' birthplaces, and this is just the one I chose. Regarding comments that I prepared, first of all, recently, and you can imagine, I've been taking part in quite a few Russia-themed events over the last year or two, and recently I was feeling much more like probably taking part in discussion about you know, the heritage of the great Jean-Paul Belmondo, rather than talking about Russia, because everything, to my mind, was pretty much said or is already said about Russia. And your report, dear colleagues from Chatham House, of which I'm still a member, is just really jolted me out of this blasé attitude towards any kind of Russia discussions, because this is really something that, to quote from Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, can be called очень своевременная штучка, a very, very timely piece, really. And now being serious, I have to say, although we definitely know and we definitely debated all these points before, but for the first time, one sees them put together and basically commented on by people who specialize in these issues for a long time. And this really is not only a passing phenomenon, to my mind, but something that can be called actually an учебное пособие. It's really like a textbook for a lot of people. And in spite of its kind of superficial simplicity, in fact, it is a very deep expose of different Western misconceptions. Most of it is, I'm not going to go through it. I agree with most of them. And I think they're very timely. This publication is very timely. Really, congratulations, James, Orysia, Monsieur Bouleg, everyone. I mean, I can't name you all, but this is wonderful. Really chapeau. But I think that this comes extremely timely because of the situation in which we now find ourselves with regard to Russia. And I think that we are at a certain watershed, which will be delineated on the 19th of September by the so-called elections to the so-called State Duma of the so-called deputies. Of course, all this, to borrow a very famous comparison, is like a Holy Roman Empire, which was not holy and didn't have anything to do with Rome and wasn't an empire in the proper sense. So I think that this is a watershed in a sense, and we'll witness it because what we've seen is not only Putin's regime moving towards essentially unbridled, unmasked, and uncamouflaged authoritarianism, if not dictatorship, but also I think, and sad to say that, it is to a certain extent the end of the Russian opposition narrative as we knew it before. And we find ourselves at the juncture in which essentially you have Alexei Navalny, the most important visible critic of Putin, in jail and at best a pawn in the future tit-for-tat exchange game that Putin may play. His team essentially decapitated, and I'm not sure it will be able to pull itself together to find a new strategy. And most of the critics are squeezed out of the country and at a loss. And in such circumstances, this kind of stark reality calls for a piece, for a compendium that you did, actually. Why? Because I do think that this evolution of the regime will lead to more problems in terms of neighbors. I'm absolutely certain that we will witness another round of the ongoing frozen war with Ukraine. B, I wouldn't exclude some kind of action that will tickle NATO defenses on NATO territory. To some extent, I think we already have it with this kind of hybrid war with migrants that Mr. Lukashenko, but in fact, with support of Mr. Putin, is waging against the European Union and NATO. Number three, we'll be seeing definitely a situation in Russia and among Russian elites or inside Russian elites, which to my mind will increasingly look as a kind of dog-eat-dog competition for the future. And in these circumstances, it's very timely that this idea of future after Putin, which may not necessarily be rosy, that is included in this lineup. I may not necessarily agree with the total gloom of this prediction, but again, I understand it's a myth and we can debate it. I do think that this third element is very important. All these elements are important, but this third element is important because what we see recently is actually the regime gradually losing the logic with which, or with the help of which, it subsisted for the last 20 plus years. And this is a very simple logic. keep the shelves of the shops well stocked, keep check-in desks at Sheremetyevo, Pulkovo, Koltsova, and the rest of it open, and keep some domestic Klapany valves open to let out the discontent, i.e. small-time publishing houses, kind of mini oligarchs toying with kind of elements of economic and probably even social liberalism and so on and so forth. And so on and so forth. It's all, I think, under threat now, because what we see is a regime in which, I don't know whether Nikolay will agree with me, the secret police has taken center stage, and a search for enemies has taken on its own logic. It cannot be stopped now because you can't say there are no enemies anymore, we destroy them, then why do you exist? So I suppose that the West will be facing Russia that is in some ways predictable, because it will keep its, the Kremlin will keep this foreign policy component, and probably, as I said, will develop it in practice with more wars and more provocation. But domestically, you will not be able to rely on the wisdoms of the last 20 years, that you'll have always the economic conservatives, the kind of Chicago schoolboys running the financial sector and the economy, and then there will be different clans of Siloviki balanced against each other. I think we're entering a stage in which there is more unpredictability even inside Russia. I'm finishing. And I think in this respect, I would like to say that what Nikolay said is true. I mean, Putin may not necessarily be replaced by someone who is kinder, gentler, and fluffier. I mean, I would like to recommend a book, actually, a fiction, a novel, written by Andrius Kubilius, whom quite a few of you in London know quite well, which is called Strange in the Kremlin Assassination. It wasn't published in Russia. I mean, it was banned in Russia. In fact, it was published in Ukraine. And it describes a situation in which a president of Russia is killed. And you know who takes over? It's a sober equivalent of Viktor Zolotov. I'm not saying that this is a great prediction, but I think it's one of the potential developments that we should look at. And in such circumstances, I would like to point out that what Nikolay said, that's the last thing I'm going to say, is important. And that is that Russian society has to be to some extent dealt with as the Soviet society was dealt with in, say, in the 70s and early 80s, i.e. people should be retold stories about democracy, free choice, the necessity to essentially take personal responsibility for their lives, basics of economics, basics of separation of powers, and basics, and that's very important, I don't want to sound like Solzhenitsyn, but I do, basics of local governance. I think, in a sense, thinking that, oh yes, you know, everyone knows in Russia how wonderful the European Union is and how they're all going to hit the streets with their favorite animal rights stickers and rainbow flags. That's a myth. That's not going to happen. Forget it. So what you need, and that is coming back to what James Sherr said quite a few times at least, the West will need Russia at peace with itself and with its neighbors. And to do that, one has to really work with civic society, but do not fleece it, do not expect it to exceed itself in the coming 30, 40, 50 years. Russia is a traumatized country, and maybe will be traumatized even more by Putin's military adventures. So it has to be basically, yes, integrated into the community of nations when there is a milder regime there, but it has to be done one step at a time with a certain respect for the Russians' desire to be slightly separate, but at the same time with a very, very significant provision. Russia has, first and foremost of all, to deal with its own issues and not continue its expansionist policies, which, by the way, feed into authoritarianism inside Russia. I think that is what maybe sane Kremlin opposition will eventually take up as a slogan. And maybe it's time for the Russian external opposition to finally stop talking not about fake circus of elections, but the real issues of what makes Putin strong. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Konstantin. Thanks a lot. Now we are moving to next comments, and now comments will come from Mr. Jurgis Vilčinskas, who is, of course, originally from Lithuania, but now represents Brussels. You know, I would not call bubble, but Brussels institutions. He represents. He is a deputy head of division of strategic communications and information analysis in European External Action Service. So please, Jurgis, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. It's always very difficult to speak after Konstantin.
Yeah, it looks like that we lost Jurgis for some time. Maybe he will come back. Then, you know, I would ask Roland Freudenstein to make his comments if he's ready. We know Roland, you know, very well as really one of the best experts of Russia in Brussels, you know, think tanks bubble, I would call it. So, you know, and he represents, for time being, Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies. We know that he is moving to another position, but I hope that he will stay with those, you know, issues, despite the fact where he will be. So, Roland, pleasure to give you the floor.
Andrius, yes, thank you, and hello, everyone. Indeed, it's great that you're having me here, and I can promise that I will remain a friend of European Russia, even in my new function with GlobSec, which is the biggest think tank in Central Europe, and I'll be the head of GlobSec Brussels. So I'd like to make 3 points. First, a congratulatory note that goes a little bit beyond niceties. Second, I'd like to voice some respectful disagreements. And third, I'll make a proposal of my own. If you ever come up with a new series of myths, I would have a proposal to make. Congratulations, colleagues, for a tremendous achievement. And that refers, first of all, of course, to the content and to the very, very necessary and timely contribution to a debate, which much too often is indeed still characterized by Putin-Versteher and their myths. But also to the method. I mean, this is fresh, you know, this is written in a snappy style. I love these questions like who is saying it? What are the implications? What can be done about it? And then conclusions at the end, absolutely fantastic, very well written. And so compliments on that. Now on point 2, I would actually like to apply some of your methods, colleagues, to your own product and ask the question, is the framing right? There are two, anyone who has read what I've written and heard what I've said over the last couple of years knows that it's number 15, it's myth number 15 and number 16 that I'm voicing respectful dissent to. So, so my first question is, are you correctly framing the myths and the narratives that are out there? And my second question indeed is, who else has been making the same points that you are making, with what purpose and with what effect? So let me start with Ben Noble and Yekaterina Schulman. It's all about Putin. I don't think many people are actually saying this. However, if you say that, if you rephrase the statement and you say Putin's Russia is the most personalized and most verticalized Russia since Stalin's times, I think we're getting to a reasonable statement. So if you put it into the relative and into a comparative mode, then it becomes actually something you can maybe argue about, but it certainly isn't idiotic and certainly isn't a myth. And now my decisive questions. I mean, who is using the argument that Putin is not all powerful, that he doesn't control everything in Russia? That's a great, that was used in the Navalny debate by the Putin versteher. You know, I mean, there has been a bunch of people, both from Russia itself and from the Kremlin's apologists in the West, who precisely used this argument as, you know, in order to soften the West's reaction. Because, like, I mean, if the Kremlin is not in control, why punish the Kremlin for something that some shady mafiosi did using chemical weapons? So, you know, and this would be my misgivings with this argument, the Kremlin is not in full control. Yes, of course, objectively speaking, that is absolutely true. Who is ever in full control of anything on this planet? I mean, even Kim Jong-un is probably not in full control of what happens in North Korea at every street corner. But the fact that, for example, the use of chemical weapons against the most prominent opposition leader must have been something that was known to and most probably instigated by Vladimir Putin, I think is a point that I would like to make. And if you say and reiterate, but Putin doesn't control everything, you may be seen as helping the people who make this case that, you know, it wasn't Putin, so don't punish him. And then, you know, just to conclude this point, I mean, in Nazi Germany, I'm sorry, I'm not making any comparison here. I'm just giving you a historic fact. In Nazi Germany, a sometimes flabbergasted, but sometimes also ironically used statement when cases of Nazi brutality emerged, such as the pogroms against the Jews in 1938, or any case of corruption or personal enrichment, wenn das der Führer wüsste. If the Führer knew this, and as I said, you know, it became ironic by some people after a while. But, you know, the drift of the statement was, you know, there is the Führer up there, and he's actually a good man. He just doesn't know everything, every nasty thing that his people are doing. You know, and that's the problem I have I'm not comparing Putin to Hitler, I'm comparing certain psychological mechanisms. And I think it should be the job of us and institutions like Chatham House to at least not aid and abet those narratives. So very briefly, the other point that you can imagine I slightly object to, and that is what comes after Putin must be better than Putin. Well, again, no one really, or very few people really say must be better than Putin. And let me quote the example that is actually given. The example that is given in the footnote about the narrative, what comes after Putin must be better. Here. here is the quote. The quote goes, in this view, the Putin regime is an anachronistic autocracy that finds itself on the wrong side of history, to borrow Barack Obama's pithy phrase. This means that if another, more democratic regime comes to power, there are good chances that Russia will fully integrate into the existing liberal international order. And there are very simply, there are two big ifs in this statement that are openly revealed. One is if Russia becomes a democracy, so the statement doesn't say Russia will become a democracy. And second, that there is a chance, there is no automatism. So this is what I really want to say here. I think the statement that an automatism for a cooperative and pro-Western Russia is a myth is true, but that's not the point we should address. What we should address is a point made by a lot of Putin defenders in Moscow, but also Putin verstehers in the West are saying the Russian nation is genetically, by some God-given law, unable to build a democracy. You know, that's the myth that we should argue against. And frankly speaking, I don't know one single nation on earth about which I would say, with any kind of justification, that it's unable to build a democratic polity, right? And we all know that post-Putin Russia, whenever it arrives, may be dangerous, chaotic, and probably will not be immediately cooperative. But Nikolay Petrov, as you said in the final sentence of your statement, you know, Russia is the Russian population, at least in the cities, and this will be the future elite of the country, is still vastly pro-European, and there is material to build on. Plus, I would say there's, as you say in your chapter, Putin is successful in his anti-Western narrative because Yeltsin was pro-Western. I would say that there is a good reason to assume that whatever comes after Putin will try to be very unlike Putin. Assumption, possibility, probability maybe, no automatism. Of course, we may see something even worse than that. But if it's unlike Putin, it might also be unlike Putin in foreign policy. And so concluding with this, I think, as Orysia correctly said, there should be no mental blocks about if we, and what goes for Ukraine goes for Russia, really. Third point, very briefly, if you ever produced a second series of myths, there is one double myth that I would like to add to the list, and that is that Russia is winning, or that Putin is winning, and that Putin is losing. Interestingly, they mutually exclude each other, but they're both wrong. And they're not only wrong, they're also very detrimental to what we all, I think we all want to achieve in terms of nudging Western policy towards the Kremlin to a better state. That very simply, Russia is winning breeds defeatism. Russia is losing breeds complacency. Both feelings are detrimental to a robust answer of the West against what Putin is representing. So having said that, again, big compliments to you, colleagues. Fantastic piece of work. And, you know, where I'm going in Globsec, this will be a glowing example. What you produce will be a glowing example of where we are, where our ambition lies to this. We want to produce this kind of stuff. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Roland. Really, as always, you know, you are creating real basis for good discussion, you know, with your very clear views and clear comments. And I see that, you know, on the chat, discussion is also going on. So perhaps that we shall not be able to finish our seminar as it was promised in 1 hour and a half. So maybe we shall prolong a little bit, but really I appreciate very much that kind of discussion. And now really I see that we can come back to Jurgis Vilčinskas. He is again with us together. So Jurgis, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And now my phone actually agreed to cooperate. So first of all, I would like to join Konstantin and Roland congratulating the crew of authors for brilliant report. I think it will be basically a benchmark for the next research steps. And my first point would be, if the authors would like to sort of get additional boost, additional validation to their efforts, I would really invite them, to look at EU versus disinfo.eu website, which our Stratcom team here in European External Action Service manages, because most of the myths that you outlined so well are actually, being collected by our team from 2016, so already 5 years. And we have, around 11,000 empirical cases, kind of, if the Kremlin-sponsored media is actually very systemic, very elaborate operations to push out some of these conspiracies and falsehoods, onto European markets, but also to the global information. These myths, or of these harmful narratives. I think, they are not so much consolidated as we see them, of course, in your report, because they are really moving with the rule of law, democracies, and so on and so on. Basically, the institutions of the West. And the interesting thing, is that if you look at some of the narratives, for example, if you look at
sorry, Jurgis, we are losing
US
the terminal.
Stuff.
Something is wrong with the connection. I don't know what, but we hear just parts of your sentences. So maybe it's maybe you should check or something like that, or we shall have you next time. I don't know, but now it's really very difficult. We cannot understand your statements. So maybe we shall check if maybe before the end we shall be able to have you again. But now I'm trying then to move forward, with our agenda, and we have two friends of our forum who asked, for the floor for short comments, and the first one would be Leonid Gozman, whom we know very well from Russia, from Moscow. Leonid, if you are connected, please, floor is yours.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Do you see me? Do you see me?
Yes, now we see you. Now we see you. Yeah.
Great.
Hello, Leonid.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And there are both bad and good news about the level of understanding of Russia in the West. The good news is that now you understand the specificity of our system much better than before. And I think you understand the threat. The bad news is that many Western politicians still underestimate the psychological, personal determination of Mr. Putin's behavior of international arena. And it's dangerous, this underestimation, because being the authoritarian leader, or we can say dictator, Putin can, as Hitler or Stalin could in their time, Putin can follow not the real needs of Russia, but his own prejudice and illusions. The nature for the normal country's motivation in international arena is the security of the country, the prosperity of the people, and so on. These goals are not among priorities for a Russian leader. And don't believe in popular idea that after so many bloody wars, Russians are especially sensitive to the topic of the security of their country. It's not true either for Russian people as a whole, nor for Putin himself. Much more important for him are much other goals, quite other goals. First, he thinks about his position in the world history. What will be written about him in the historical textbooks? And he wants to be presented there, not only as a great leader of Russia, collector of Russian lands and so on, but as a winner of the West. His hatred to the Western civilization is honest and authentic. He hates you. He really hates you. And to create the problems for you is much more important for him than to resolve the problems of his own country. In all direct or indirect contacts with the West, Russia does not try to find win-win solution. She is trying to create a maximum damage for you guys. And the second motivation, which is very important for him. You know, prominent American psychologist Harold Laswell in 30th and 20th century said that politician is a person who solves his personal problems using the political actions. Beginning the war, for example. Putin's personal problem is his feelings that he is not respectable, not loved, not accepted. It's from his childhood. And he does not feel difference between the fear from one hand and respect from another hand. For him, you afraid of me equals to you respect me. So he doesn't want to be a good neighbor for you. He wants to be the source of threat. He dreams to be a world leader of anti-Western coalition. So you, the West, should afraid of him, and the rest of the world will admire him as he thinks, as he believes, and will admire him because he is against you. So he is not an easy partner for you, but for us, he's even worse. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Leonid. Thanks a lot for your comment. And now I know that my colleague, Rasa Juknevičienė, now member of European Parliament, wants also to make a short comment, and she's able to join us on video. Rasa, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for this very good report. It will be my textbook, I think, especially when we will speak in Inge committee, which works with disinformation, and Russia, of course, is one of the most important countries providing disinformation, spreading disinformation. But Roland did what I wanted to add to when I saw the content of the report. I wanted to say that most maybe powerful myth is on democracy, on democratization, possible democratization of Russia. It's very useful for Putin and Kremlin regime to deal with the West, where majority of the people think that Russia will never become different, that Russia always will live under the dictatorship, that to become a European nation is impossible, that Russia is very special statehood, and Russians have their own way of life. They are spreading this every day over their own country and also abroad. So they are implementing this not only inside but outside as well. And it's also very useful because when many leaders of the biggest powers, they think that Russia will never become different, it means that we have to deal with Russia as it is, with the dictatorship, with Putin. So that's why some politicians, leaders speak about dialogue, because they don't believe that Russia will be different. If they would believe that Russia will be different, they would look for another kind of strategy. And unfortunately, my last sentence is about media in the West, that Western media also very often accepts such myths, and it's very important to have some dialogue with journalists in the Western countries. And when they accept this, when titles or headlines in media are on with such myths, mythology, it's some kind of victory of Kremlin, as it happened, for example, with the expression Ukrainian crisis. Of course, it is not Ukrainian crisis. It is Russian war against Ukraine. But we very often, even ourselves, we use this expression saying Ukrainian crisis. Then people understand somewhere in other countries that, oh, those Ukrainians, they made a crisis and they are problem. Not Kremlin is problem, but Ukraine is problem. So this is the same with other myths. And again, thank you for this report.
Well, thanks, Rasa. And now our last attempt to have Jurgis Vilčinskas for short, intervention. Jurgis, please, maybe now its connection will be better. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks for not leaving me outside. I wanted to draw one interesting sort of, in my mind, comment, on the study. It's the kind of the changing nature of these narratives and myths. If you look, for example, today on what Russian-controlled media is talking about, U.S. leaving pullover from Afghanistan, you will see the narrative, that basically U.S. is abandoning its allies, and it will abandon its allies, in Ukraine or Taiwan and elsewhere. So it's a kind of, if you like, it's a modern refurbished version, of myth number 6 in the Chatham House report, which says, that we must improve relations with Russia, If you look at another kind of, if you like, refurbished myth or narrative, you can find it, for example, in the narratives that Kremlin media pushes out on the vaccines and on the pandemics. You would hear a very systemic story, that it is big pharma, that doesn't allow, for example, Russian vaccines on European market, or there is a Russophobia, there's a conspiracy against Russia, coming out from specific European member states, and my own homeland, Lithuania, or Poland or others, are being kind of put as the bad actors, who act against Russia. So, what I basically want to say that, these myths, these narratives are very actively, if you like, refurbished these days on different global information environments. And, actually, I think, the next study that Chatham House should do should not only limit themselves, to Europe and European misconceptions, but probably even look globally, because if you think about, I don't know, Russia Today, or Sputnik in Arabic, these media outlets controlled by Kremlin probably has even larger impact of the audiences in Middle East, than, in some of the European audiences. Now, the last thing I wanted to flag in my really short comment is the need probably to look at the effectiveness of what Kremlin media is doing these days, whether pushing out these narratives and these myths is effective sort of influence on European elites, on European public or not. And many of us, I think, in short term, are kind of tempted to think, that, okay, we can debunk these myths, we can take this brilliant Chatham House report, and spread it around, and, people will be aware of what's happening, and they will be, more resilient to some of these falsehoods. But here I would probably, put a big warning sign, because I think, subversion that we see coming from Kremlin-controlled media, so-called media infrastructure, is actually a long-term game. And I think, these myths are really riding, if you like, on the wave of identity politics in Europe, in the US, riding on the wave of algorithms, who tends to promote conspirational content, online. So offering all kind of alternative realities. And then last point, I think, besides Russia, I mean, we also need to think about other imitators, which will be, let's say, willing or are already willing to come up with a very similar strategy. And, if you look at another country a bit further to the east, a bigger country and with much more resources, China, I mean, you will see that, this country is already borrowing, the narratives, borrowing the social media manipulation techniques, borrowing, in many ways, Russian playbooks to create these misconceptions and myths. So I'm afraid, there will be a lot more venue and space for the future research in this field. And thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jurgis. And really, so we are a little bit out of time. We are moving now to the last, stage. I hope that it will be not very long, maybe, up to 10 minutes, if possible, to ask, to continue seminar. And we have several questions which were put on the chat, and, they are, the questions are asked to those representatives of Chatham House who made the presentation of the report. So maybe I will read very shortly, questions from the chat to first of all to James Sherr, then to Orysia Lutsevych and Nikolay Petrov, and then at the end with James Nixey, we shall conclude our seminar, making final very short remarks. So now I will read the question to James Sherr, and the question comes from Dmitro Shkurko, Ukrainian Forum. The question sounds like that. You have mentioned Ukraine's EU aspiration as a casus belli for Russia. Can the recent article, which was written by Putin and was announcing Ukrainians as the same people as Russian, be considered as unconditional casus belli for Russia to invade Ukraine? What could be the means to avoid such a scenario? So James, if you can answer that question and also make your concluding remarks in a short intervention, that would be brilliant. So please, floor is yours.
Okay, I have to leave in 2 minutes, so I will make this short. Mr. Shkurko, one of the purposes of this Ukraine article of Putin was a major purpose, is simply intimidation. There are no clear red lines here. The only definition of what would be a Ukrainian anti-Russian policy of Ukraine acting as the instrument for external powers being under external control. None of this is defined or definable. All of this is to be determined by Vladimir Putin, and it is designed not only in Ukraine, but in the West to inhibit people and prevent a proper discussion about where Ukraine's actual interests lie, where the interests of the Western countries lie. This is the problem with all this discussion about Russia's red lines. Let's be very clear. The Kremlin can decide to move the goalposts tomorrow in the most dramatic and brutal way, even before any red lines we've been discussed have been crossed. They could decide to do this tomorrow just because they think circumstances will be right, and they will advance their objectives. So I don't think we should torture ourselves with these questions. So I hope that is at least a partial answer to you. We have to demonstrate, and I would include those people in Ukraine who are minded to do so, that we understand our own interests, we understand the power at our disposal, and we will pursue our our policy in a determined and purposeful manner. And that is the only way to secure Russia's attention and respect, not by answering their questions. And if you forgive me, I must now say goodbye to everyone with great reluctance. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, James. Thanks a lot very much. No, really appreciate your participation in our seminar. And now I'm moving to questions to Orysia. First question comes from Olesia me, and the question sounds like that. Does Eastern Partnership policy can be perceived as an important tool for identity formation in Ukraine, or it is rather Russia's aggression that has had a stronger impact on identity transformation in Ukraine since 2014? And here is also another question, which is from Dmitry Shkurko. You mentioned Russian beliefs that Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova are doomed to follow Russia, including its political and social architecture. Do you consider vice versa? Russia will be doomed to follow the example of the countries mentioned if they succeed in democratic development. Is this idea still alive in Ukraine, apart from isolationism and the concept of trench with crocodiles on the border with Russia? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. It's good to see so many fellow Ukrainians active in this discussion. What I would say on the first one, definitely what in Ukraine is perceived that this current Ukraine-Russian war is the war for independence, and definitely Putin helped a lot by this unexpected to many, especially in the southeast of Ukraine, aggression, to ask themselves what it means to be Ukrainian. And what it means to be Ukrainian, the answer was given, is respect for liberty, is respect for human rights, it's protecting territorial borders of Ukraine. But what European Union does, it helps Ukrainians to be the citizens they want to be, which means, you know, to have self-governance. And this is why we have decentralization that is supported a lot by the European Union, to have justice, to have a just society, which is very important for Ukraine. And that's why European Union focuses on the rule of law. And finally, if you look at what Ukrainians believe, one of the largest achievements of Ukraine's independent state, it's visa-free regime. It's Ukrainians being able to exercise this liberty of mobility and feeling part of the European family. So I would say yes. And now quickly on Dmytro's question, and I would be actually more interested to hear what Russians think about it themselves, because I think there's a certain complacency also about whether Ukraine could be a blueprint for reform. But I tell you this, what Ukraine shows is that any transformation requires two forces. And this force number one is actually new forces in the society that want to have new rule of games. And now you have coalition of the forces, of these new forces in case of Ukraine, of course, European Union, United States, other G7 countries. So I do hope that new forces in Russia will be looking at Ukraine the way Ukraine actually was looking at Polish transformation. And Ukrainian blueprint for decentralization comes a lot from Poland. And to conclude, I would like very much to reiterate and perhaps add to the collection of myths that it was Eastern Partnership enlargement that provoked Ukraine-Russian war. Actually, no, it was this lack of political institutions and the fact that Nikolay described, Russia going in completely opposite direction and Ukraine building exactly the institutions of election, self-governance, public policy that clashed on Ukrainian-Russian border and led to this war. And I think, as Roland wisely called us not to be complacent, because, you know, there are still battles. We did not win the struggle. And we still need to make this leap where we could say there is a certain tipping point clearly in Ukraine. And I mean, I'm really sorry we don't have time to discuss Belarus, because until we also address the Russian question, there will not be independent, sovereign and democratic Belarus. Thank you so much for this event.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And now to Nikolay Petrov. I see one question perhaps, which is coming from Ekaterina Poletaeva. On your opinion, what kind of approach shall the EU have to open Russia and to make it more democratic? Shall it be stricter or shall it be more open for cooperation? So Nikolay, and in general, your comment on the whole debate, because I think that you have some comments to Roland comments, you know, so please go on.
Yeah. First of all, thanks a lot. It was a very interesting discussion and hopefully we'll continue with it. The picture I've described was commented as a gloomy one. I'll be very glad to be wrong, because this is the picture of my own country. And unfortunately, the neutral analysis of different probabilities leads to the conclusion I made, but I'll be very glad to make a mistake. And I would invite participants, those who can participate with Russian language, to join discussion on 9th at Sakharov Center. It's about whether Russia is moving in direction of Turkmenistan or not. And there are several interesting European participants there, and we'll discuss there different ways and different visions of how the country is developing. The difference, what Roland was saying was the difference between Yeltsin and Putin, and thus the probability for Putin to be replaced by a different kind of ruler. First of all, I would say that there is no great difference between Yeltsin and Putin in terms of Russia's relations with the West, except for Russia's weakness. And there are several publications by Dmitry Greenburg, who is saying that there is very serious continuity in Russian foreign policy. The difference lies in the fact that in the 90s, Russia was too weak to occupy position it did occupy later. So I would not see, and Putin was growing as a politician inside Yeltsin's regime. So he's not a guy who is totally different in this particular sense. He's different. Well, he was young, Yeltsin was old, he was not drinking a lot, and that's why the image that Putin is absolute alternative to Yeltsin did appear. But I'm afraid that the fact that the next ruler will be different doesn't mean first that the regime will be different, and it does not it will not lead to the improvement of Russia's relations with the West, which is a kind of cornerstone in any further development of Russia. And we should wait for step-by-step, decades-long transformation in positive direction at best. And the third is Ekaterina's question. I would see that it's needed not to isolate Russia. It's dangerous way. It's needed first to make a difference between Putin and his regime and Russians in whole, and that's why I'm a strong supporter of making visas regime easier for ordinary Russians. and I'm supporter of cooperation, limited cooperation in those areas where cooperation between Russia and the West is really needed. And we should not forget about the fact that Russia is huge, not in terms of its population and of its economic weight, but in terms of its territory. And there are understandable problems, European problems and global problems like climate problems, climate changes, which cannot be fixed in an effective way without cooperation with different regimes. So we should not look only at the fact that, well, there are authoritarian features or even totalitarian features sometimes in Russian domestic politics, and Russia behaves in a way it behaves in foreign policy, if only having in mind that there are certain problems Russia is faced by, just like European Union is faced by, or the whole world is faced by. So I would speak in favor of limited cooperation in terms of cooperation with the regime, against isolation, which is very dangerous in my view. And I would speak in favor of the openness of Europe and openness of the West with regard to ordinary Russians, which is the way how to keep Russia and how to avoid its moving in a negative direction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Nikolay. And now, James Nixey, I'm asking, your final comments. There are no specific questions to you, but if you read, some comments, so there are. But in general, you can comment over, on all the debate, which was really very interesting. And so again, thanks a lot for your report.
Well, thank you very much, sir. And really, I won't take very long at all, because I just feel guilty that I think we're 23 minutes over time now, and I don't want to take up anybody's time too much, other than to say, first of all, actually to the respondents in particular, all five of you, that I am gratified and somewhat embarrassed actually by the praise, and really intrigued by the, shall we say, friendly critique, the challenges, if you like, that you've made to the report and to some of the authors. And I think they're all entirely fair, entirely reasonable, and I only wish we could debate them more, because I think they are well worth debating. And I potentially agree with you, and I say that as, if you like, the lead author on this report. And yet I think those challenges are often entirely correct. And I wish we could go into that in a lot more detail. Roland's point, I believe, about whether Putin is winning or Putin is losing, I think is extremely valid. All is clearly still to play for, which I suppose is what we're all doing here. And then you yourself, sir, referred to the 10 principles, the 10 commandments, I think you said, for dealing rationally and effectively with Russia. And I think if we could all, have a little bit more honesty and less expediency on the part of some of the decision makers, then we'd go a long way. And it wouldn't take that much. It wouldn't take that much more money. It wouldn't take that much more time or effort, but it just takes a lot more willpower, backbone, and maybe spine. And that's unfortunately where we seem to be lacking so often. But we should be positive, as I think Roland was saying, and I think most people are saying, and that positivity doesn't necessarily go with cooperation or dreams of some sort of partnership of cooperation, but really it can lead to I think it could lead to a much more rational policy. As far as I believe my internet connection is failing, which is probably just as well. So I'll hand back to you.
Well, thanks a lot, James. Really. First of all, I appreciate very much for your job, for the report, which created such a really very interesting and very important discussion in our forum. I think that this seminar was one of the best which we had during last year. So thanks a lot to everybody who did that report. Second, very short, here was very important question. So will Russia become a different one? I think that definitely we shall face developments in Russia, which is difficult to predict, but several points I want to mention. First of all, next week elections, if we can call them elections, but what we see now from opinion polls, I see very big difference. Of course, Putin will manipulate, and he will create majority in Rada, in any case. But the votes for the United Russia Party are much, smaller than it was before. If to look into predictions that United Russia Party will get only 30%, when in 2016 it got, 2016 it got 54. Before that, in 2011, more than 59, and so on. So it's a big difference. It's a big difference which is coming. Second, if you look into Levada, opinion polls that younger generation, younger than 40 years old, in 2024, are not ready to vote for Putin. Only around 40% of them are ready to vote. That is again big difference. And the last point, where I see that the difference will come, is not connected directly with Russia, but it's connected more with the EU, with a Green Deal, which, if it will be implemented, as it is planned now, so it will cut EU dependency on Russian gas in 2035 by 75%. So it's a huge difference, which will have a major impact on Russian economical development. And I hope that it will bring also major factor which can bring also major political change. So that's on can Russia become different one? I think that really, and that is what will keep us busy with our seminars and our reports. Thanks a lot again to Chatham House, and I would like to use an opportunity to say a few words about our future activities. Next week, really, we shall have big debate in the European Parliament on the report, which I said before, that we have really important report on recommendations. What kind of EU policy towards Russia should be developed by EU institutions? Debate will be on September 14. You can watch online. On September 15, we shall have another seminar of our Forum of the Friends of European Russia. And that seminar will be, we shall have possibility to have a presentation of second report of that series, which is called Export of Russian Corruption. And this will be the report made by Vladimir Milov, and the report is called Putin's Network of Influence in Western Europe. So follow our information and our announcements, and really we shall be very happy to see you on that seminar. And on 23rd of September, we are planning also to have a seminar where we shall try to evaluate what elections to Duma, what kind of results they brought. So those are our plans. Now, really, again, I would like to thank everybody, and especially my team, Mante, Jonas, and Katya, who were working with this seminar as always. And so, good luck to everybody. Hope to see you later.
Ačiū labai. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Ačiū.